Good evening and welcome. I am Lori Minetti, a member of the program committee. Tonight's program is being presented by Dr. Ellen Knight. Ellen has been involved with the Society for many years, having served as president, lecturer, and docent on trolley tours on Town Day. She is also Winchester's reference archivist. Ellen is continually looking into Winchester's history to uncover hidden stories. Tonight's program reflects that. So let me turn this over to Ellen, who will share stories of Winchester residents who were part of the aviation industry. Ellen?
There are many stories in aviation history, many types of stories, from tales of triumph to those of tragedy. This program is focused, of course, on connections to Winchester and on stories capturing the spirit of this quote from the famous World War I aviator Eddie Rickenbacker. Aviation is proof that given the will, we have the capacity to achieve the impossible. I'm going to go in reverse chronological order and start with something which was impossible when I and many of you were born. Flying is out of space. Did anyone from Winchester realize that ambition? Yes. Astronaut Rick Houck. Though born in Long Beach, California, according to his official NASA biography, Houck considers Winchester and Washington, D.C. his hometowns. His father being in the Navy, the family moved around a bit. Years ago, Houck wrote to me that I lived in Winchester first very briefly in 1942-43. Our family moved back to Winchester in 1952. We bought a house at 41 Canterbury Road. I attended 7th, 8th, and 9th grades in Winchester. My mother later moved back to the Canterbury Road home and lived there until her death in 1989. So the dreams and ambitions which led to Houck's travels into space were nurtured in Winchester. Though he graduated from high school in D.C., he returned to the Boston area to attend Tufts and MIT. Upon graduating from Tufts, he was commissioned in the Navy and began flight training in 1966. Among his assignments, he served as a project test pilot. In fact, he was named the Navy's outstanding test pilot for 1972. I had always wanted to fly, he said, and I did fly for a number of years, but through a succession of career changes, I heard about the space program. I was 35, and I thought I was too old. But he wasn't too old. In 1978, NASA selected Houck as an astronaut candidate. To focus on just one mission, he was a pilot for the 7th Space Shuttle mission aboard the orbiter Challenger, launched on June 18, 1983. The most famous crew member of that mission is probably Sally Ride. But in Winchester, it was Rick making headlines, especially after their return. For NASA sent the crew on the road making extensive public relations appearances promoting the space programs. One of the places on Rick's tour was Winchester. October 28, 1983 was a stirring day, the selectmen wrote. It marked the return of Captain Frederick Houck, a bona fide hometown hero. During the time he spent in our midst, Captain Houck recalled with generosity and nostalgia how significant growing up in Winchester had been to his career achievements. He attended a reception at the Jenks Center and a dinner at the country club, and the next day spoke to school groups. The Winchester Star reported that wearing his blue NASA overalls, he was a striking picture of inspiration as he impressed school children with exciting tales of life aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. Being in space is the sort of thing you can't really describe, he told Winchester. There is the fun aspect of it, floating around, weightless for 6 days. You can see some things on Earth in a way that have never been seen before, except from space. One night, when I was floating in the vicinity of my seat, I looked down and saw the lights and fires all up and down the length of the Nile. I saw the city of Alexandria and all the tiny communities along the river bank. Knowing what I was seeing was not on television or in the movies, it was real. It made me think a little more. It made it easier to feel closer to the people down there, to be able to look down and see everything and realize we all have the same aims: to survive, make a living, and enjoy our lives. Haug has been presented with many honors. He told me it was an honor to see his name listed on the town's webpage of outstanding residents. Medals and honors, of course, abounded during the era when Winchester had the most aviators, World War II. There were too many to talk about, so I will mention a few standouts. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the war in the Pacific was not going well for the Allies. Although a change was around the corner with the Battle of Midway, in May 1942, morale needed a lift. Then came good news. Overnight on May 5th, 6th, flights of American bombers in India attacked a key airdrome in Burma. A communique from General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters reported that enemy planes were all but wiped out. And it named one of the lead pilots, Winchester's James Keenan, Winchester High School class of 1929. Winchester had its first aviation hero of the war. His mother, when interviewed by the Boston Globe, said that Jimmy was always mechanically inclined and that he and a friend in high school built a plane with a motor taken from a motorcycle, and it actually flew 2 or 3 times. That adventure ended when the friend, who was the chief architect of the scheme, crashed the plane. Jimmy made headlines in 1941 for marrying a movie star and made more during the war. Keenan not only flew over the Bay of Bengal, but also crossed the Pacific, the Atlantic, and Mediterranean as a pilot and flight leader. After a visit home on leave in 1943, the Winchester star passed on a few personal anecdotes, one of which sounded near impossible to me. While he was flying low in clouds over Egypt, his gyro stuck, and when he leveled out, he went into a tight spiral, which he was lucky to pull out of. As he tried to land, he burned out a brake and almost ground looped. Taking off again, the plane ran out of oxygen at 32,000 feet. All he could do before passing out was put the plane in a dive and hope he'd come to in time to do something about it. He regained consciousness at 18,000 feet, with the plane diving 330 miles per hour for Tobruk. And of course, he added, people were shooting at us. Every combat pilot surely has stories about being lucky to get home. Captain Charles Joyce, Winchester High School class of 1939, earned the nickname Doc for managing to fly badly wounded planes to safe landings. In November 1944, he made headlines for spectacular dead stick landing of his superfortress Raiden Maiden in India. Just within sight of base, with the plane out of gas, with its power cut, Joyce put the plane into a dive, guided it to a touchdown 40 feet short of the runway, wrestled it onto the airstrip, and rolled safely past an amazed and cheering crowd gathered around the control tower. On his last mission in 1945, while over Japan, one engine caught fire, and then there was an explosion in another. Then they ran into a thunderstorm. Their speed and altitude dropped. The plane went into a partial stall and dropped 3,000 feet. He radioed that he would probably ditch, but instead kept going. The crew pried loose and jettisoned anything they could to reduce the weight. Maintaining a speed constantly 25 to 30 miles above the stalling point, Joyce kept flying for 5.5 hours, reached base, and landed okay. Richard Leghorn flew aerial reconnaissance. A member of Winchester High School, class of 1935, Leghorn was active in the science club, was editor of the yearbook, and here he's shown seated next to future paratrooper John Hanlon, and gave the salutatory address at his graduation at age 16, speaking on science and education. At age 20, he graduated from MIT with a Bachelor of Science in Physics and a reserve commission as an Army second lieutenant. He began working for the Eastman Kodak Company, but accepted an active duty assignment in research and development at an Air Force Aeronautical Photographic Laboratory, 6 months before Pearl Harbor. Brilliant and intrepid, going overseas in 1943, he commanded photo recon squads. Starting in January 1944, in preparation for D-Day, he and his unit began flying missions from England over northern France, gathering detailed intelligence by photographing German forces, bridges, rail junctions, airfields, communications facilities, and other targets. After the landings on June 6th, Leghorn's unit flew in support of the U.S. First Army as it advanced through France and Belgium, including the Battle of the Bulge, and the drive into Germany during the spring of 1945. In September 1944, Leghorn was interviewed by a Globe reporter. He had just returned from a reconnaissance flight along the Rhine, where he said he had no weapon except a camera. The Germans were then in retreat, and Leghorn's group was getting indication of what direction they were taking. The amount of work the group did, the reporter wrote, was indicated by their laboratory developing ordinarily 60,000 prints of photographs each day. The planes, Leghorn said, flew in the dirtiest kind of weather, even when the ceilings were practically zero. He flew missions at high altitudes to try to avoid enemy flak and fighters, but this self-described risk-taker also modified aircraft for taking detailed pictures flying low over the battles. "You'd like to know my biggest thrill?" he asked the Globe reporter. "It was going over the Falaise Pocket at 1,800 feet in a puddle-jumping L5 and taking pictures of the battle with a hand camera." By VE Day, Leghorn had been awarded several medals, including a Silver Star, for accomplishing a reconnaissance flight over Germany, from which those who had attempted it previously had failed to return. But Leghorn did the hitherto impossible. He returned, despite an engine on fire and 58 bullet holes riddling his plane. His job was not easy. Leghorn's post-war career was increasingly impressive, his concerns including satellite reconnaissance capability and public policy related to national security, arms control, and disarmament. His obituary stated that he takes his place among a short list of unsung heroes whose role in the Cold War may have averted nuclear catastrophe. But while fascinating, that is not tonight's history. At this point, there is another outstanding World War II flyer from Winchester to remember. Among the many names on Winchester's Rolls of Honor, there is one, and only one, belonging to an aviatrix. Not only a full-fledged commercial pilot as a teenager, Gertrude Meserve was an original member of the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, later renamed Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs. According to her Winchester High School class of 1938 yearbook, Gertrude Meserve was an all-round girl. An honor student, she was a star basketball player and captained the varsity team in her senior year through an unbeaten season. Meserve, who had been keen on aviation since she was a child making model airplanes, began to learn to fly while a high school student. Her ambition, her yearbook states, was to be an airline demonstrator, and her scholastic intention for the next year was aviation school. True to her dreams, after graduation, she was flying over Boston and Winchester. "I was on top of the world," she told me when I spoke with her in 2008. In July 1938, the Winchester Star reported, "Gertrude has been flying since early spring from the Wiggins Airfield in East Boston, and since her graduation has been devoting her entire time to the exacting training which all aviators must undergo. She received her solo license on Tuesday. 2 months later, she earned her private certificate, then got a commercial certificate. At age 19, she became the youngest full-fledged commercial pilot in all America. She made several headlines in the newspapers, some for moments of danger, but the papers always reported she handled those situations with assurance and capability. After getting her licenses, Meserve went to work. Things just fell into my lap," she said. "I was hired by the people who taught me how to fly." She became a flight instructor in Boston and taught students from MIT, Harvard, Northeastern, and Tufts. Impossible. A girl teaching men how to fly? She did it. In 1941, Gertrude spoke out for women pilots joining the military. During the war, a step in that direction was taken when the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron was created in September 42 to ferry military planes from the factories to the military fields. This experimental route proved women could fly military aircraft. By 1942, there were about 3,000 licensed women pilots in the country. Most did not meet the WAF's requirements: 500 hours flight time, 200 horsepower rating, recent cross-country experience, and a high school diploma. Telegram invitations to join the WAFs went out to 83 women, including Missouri. "I had all the qualifications except horsepower," she said. "I got that within a week." 12th among those who accepted the invitation, she moved to the Newcastle Army Base in Delaware and became one of the 25 original women ferry pilots. The squadron was a success. The original mission was to ferry trainers and light aircraft from the factories, but later they were delivering fighters, bombers, and transports as well. Missouri's favorite plane was the P-47. She delivered about 200 of them. She said, "Flying for the WAFs was like flying on cloud nine," which is an understatement. There was a lot of skepticism about using women pilots. The men did not want to use us. "Oh, you girls can't fly," she told me they said. But not so. "It's easy," she said. "Just move the controls. Once you know how to fly, you can fly any plane." Missouri served with the WAFs and WASPs until the program was deactivated in December 1944. After the war, she lived in New Jersey, where her husband was an executive pilot with Curtiss Wright. Though the WASPs served the military, they themselves were classified as civilians, and so after the war were not classified as veterans. The GI Bill Improvement Act of 1977 finally granted them the distinction of full military status for their war service. In 1984, each WASP was awarded the World War II Victory Medal. In Winchester, however, Gertrude's name has been on the World War II Roll of Honor since it was first set in position outside Town Hall, and it was carried over to the memorial created at the O'Connell Plaza. When informed of the plans for that new memorial, she said, "I'm going to be proud to be on it." Someone else from Winchester was involved with the Women's Ferrying Corps, but not another aviatrix. It was George Creamer, a native of the town. He became a commercial pilot and flight instructor based in Boston, Lowell, and later Oklahoma. During the war, he served as a captain in the U.S. Army Air Corps and trained hundreds of women in flying military craft at Avenger Airfield in Texas. Now, this was the friend whom Jimmy Keenan helped build and fly an airplane in 1929. It did indeed have a motorcycle engine, also a 5-gallon gas tank. This screen shows a difference of opinion about where it was built and where he lived, though the Winchester censuses place him definitely at his family's home on Forest Street, near the Stoneham line. Both articles agree that the plane was kept at a flying field in Woburn. Did he fly it in Winchester? Maybe. If not, if I may digress a moment, were there ever any documented flights within Winchester? Yes. There was once a branch of Filene's on Main Street. In January 1947, Filene's launched a helicopter delivery route, including Winchester, Belmont, Wesley, Cambridge, and Boston. The first shiny red helicopter was greeted by the chairman of the Board of Selectmen and others at Shore Road Field, which is now the site of the high school. In October 1961, when Governor Volpe was flown home by helicopter, his pilot used Manchester Field. Earlier, in July 1961, when a Cessna was running out of gas and the pilot decided on an emergency landing, he cited the Country Club. There being too many people at the 10th green, he taxied the long fairway to the 15th. No heroes welcome for him. During World War I, about 16 Winchester men became pilots. To me, the training sounds impossible. Bob Fogg wrote his father in May 1918 that you have to steer in 3 directions instead of 1. Also, you have to keep going. He wrote to his sister about the acrobatic stage, learning loops, spins, and rolls, and learning what air sickness was. And no wonder, he wrote, for your insides are turned and twisted and thrown in all directions. You lose all sense of direction. The earth seems to be tipping and rocking, first below you, then above. Suddenly, after a mad plunge downward by a violent backward lurch, the earth changes places with the sky. You feel yourself leaving the seat, your weight sags into the life belt, and there you are, hanging upside down like a trapeze performer and thinking of what a small strap it is. But he concluded, flying like running an auto is easy after you get onto it. Fogg so mastered flying that he was assigned to be an instructor. Bert Kinsley, a near lifelong resident of Cambridge Street, finished his training in France. It was intensive, as he wrote his brother Guy. This combat work is very hard, and the strain is very tiring. It is nothing but falling around all the time. This work is all done at an altitude varying from 15,000 to 22,000 feet. We do all the trick work we know as if in actual combat. This consists of zooming, Immelman turns, perpendicular turns, looping, diving chandelles, side slipping, and tail spins. Very hard work. Kinsley was assigned to the 90th Aero Squadron 3rd Observation Group doing reconnaissance and observation. As Leghorn found out a war later, flying reconnaissance does not mean you are not in combat. Kinsley was at some major campaigns, was shot down once, was credited for 2 German planes shot down in the Argonne Drive, and for taking part in 17 individual combats. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in action in France on October 7th, 1918. While staking the advanced lines of the 80th Division, he was attacked by 8 enemy machines, which dived from a nearby cloud bank. Although attacked simultaneously by enemy planes, he placed his airplane in such a position that his observer was able to shoot down and crash one enemy plane and disable a second so badly that it was forced to land. Later, on the same mission, he was attacked again by a patrol of 5 enemy planes, scout machines, and in a running fight, he drove these off and successfully completed his mission. One of his commanding officers wrote that Kinsley was not just a capable pilot. He has always, the captain wrote, been one of the first to volunteer for the most difficult and dangerous missions. He flew in the worst possible kind of weather. By his coolness and skill as a pilot on active fronts, he has been a source of great inspiration to pilots and observers joining the squadron, and has thus contributed in an unusual degree to the esprit which has made possible the squadron's success. But it's time to leave military aviation and take a look at some commercial flyers. After that war, if a pilot wanted to use his skills to make a living, what could he do? There were air cargo services, but few places had airports, and people weren't hopping on planes to get around as they do today. So when we look at the life of a pilot in the 1920s and 30s, we're looking at pioneers. One occupation was flying the mail. Before moving to Winchester, Paul Collins did that. Collins had served in France as a pursuit flyer. 3 years after regular U.S. mail flights began in 1918, he became one of the original airmail pilots, hired by the U.S. Postal Service, and flew the first scheduled night airmail service. He was the first pilot to fly transcontinental airmail and passenger service. From piloting, he went into airline management, which was his field when he moved to Winchester in 1935. But this isn't our subject tonight, but I will just mention that his company was National Airways, which later became Northeast Airlines and later merged with Delta. In the beginning, Collins was company president. Amelia Earhart was a vice president. Earhart was a key figure in marketing the new company. For each city which was a likely prospect for their air service, lists of people in influential positions were prepared. Each person was contacted by mail and invited to come to the airport on a specified date to meet Miss Amelia Earhart. Did Collins ever bring her out to Winchester? Yes, at least twice. But when she made her only public appearance north of Boston, was it in Winchester? No. Medford, where she once lived. But whoever lives at 6 Lantern Lane can say Amelia Earhart dined here. But the Winchester resident who stands out as an early commercial pilot was Robert Stevens Fogg. Though often described as a pioneer in New Hampshire air services, Bob Fogg, as a man of daring do, who barnstormed, set flying records, and made headlines for thrilling, perilous, and magnificently successful flights, experienced adventures that were followed across the country. Aviation history remembers Bob Fogg for establishing one of the first and finest airports in New Hampshire at Concord, operating a popular seaplane service at Lake Winnipesaukee, where he safely took up over 50,000 passengers during a 15-year period, flying the first rural free delivery airmail route, helping airports form around New England, where he starred in many an air show, plus a few adventures I'll tell you about. Fogg moved to Winchester with his family, parents George and Mabel and sister Gladys, in 1900 at age 3. The parents were friends of the McCalls, and George was a second cousin of James Solomon Sanborn, the Coffee King. George once said of the Fogg family that we are an unostentatious, commonplace people. No great single name overshadows us and irritates us with incentives to live up to their standard. His children were anything but commonplace. Nearly 16 years Bob Sr., Gladys enjoyed a successful career as a concert soprano. Her brother flew high in a more literal way. Winchester first knew Bob as a boy with a passion for automobiles and wireless. His father afforded him opportunities to indulge these interests. In 1906, George Fogg, formerly a ticket agent, turned his hand to managing the Winchester Automobile Company. He first used the old Kelly and Haas stable on Winchester Place, opening a new building in 1914 on Converse Place, which is now the China Sky restaurant. At age 77, Fogg recalled Winchester Place, and driving Dad's Oldsmobile, Polk, Toledo, Stevens, Maxwell, Grout, etc., all over and around the area. And his driving was noticed. When Louis de Rochemont, who later founded the March of Time film news series, was a boy in Winchester, he made short newsreels shown in neighboring movie houses. In 1915, he produced one titled Bobby Fogg in His Flivver. At age 16, Fogg obtained a first-grade commercial wireless operator's license. In that era, he said, I was a wireless nut, building sets for kids all over town. He had a station in the old garage built in 1915. But in 1915, got a town permit to build a wood-frame wireless station, the one and only in town, at his father's home on Highland Avenue. A third boyhood interest was aeroplanes. At age 15, he began studying aeronautics, and he bought an early Blériot monoplane, keeping it in the old Kelly and Haas stable. Before he could fly it, though, the engine vanished. His father later confessed to having taken it out because broken hearts heal quicker than broken necks. Yet it was the railroad which truly broke hearts when Mabel Fogg was killed by a train while crossing the tracks downtown in 1914. Her son stated, "It meant the end of home life for me, and I became somewhat of a nomad." For 3 more years, his home base was still Winchester, but by 1917, many could see the possibility of the nation joining the European War. He joined the Air Force, he wrote, and fell madly in love with flying. During the war, Fogg was assigned as an instructor in Texas. Afterward, he took up barnstorming, traveling through Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri, selling rides and giving sensational aerial shows, doing all the loops, spirals, and rolls he had learned, hanging by his feet from the landing gear, walking out on the wings, and more. Like other pilots, when asked what was the greatest danger a pilot faced, he said, starvation, since any money raised went into the care of the planes. Coming back east in 1920 and visiting family in New Hampshire, where the family had a summer home, he saw the potential for an airport in Concord and found a place to settle. With financial backing from his father, he bought a plane and began building up civilian air services in New England. Also in New Hampshire, he started his successful seaplane pleasure trip service at Lake Winnipesaukee. The Winchester Star is sprinkled with little notes that this or that party flew with Bob. Articles, lectures, and web pages, and a book have been written about his work in New Hampshire, so I will focus on 3 special assignments: his flights following the Vermont floods, the Bremen landing, and the Viking explosion. Vermont's Great Flood of November 1929 was devastating. Hundreds of miles of roads and nearly 1,300 bridges swept away, countless homes and buildings destroyed, and the railroad out of commission. As it was the railroad which delivered the mail, incoming mail began seriously piling up. New York's governor offered National Guard planes to a state which had no airport. Makeshift airfields were prepared, but the National Guard pilots weren't very well trained, and the increasingly cold weather wreaked havoc with the water-cooled engines of their World War I planes. Such was the situation as described in an article by Richard S. Allen, whose materials and illustrations by Hamilton Green I am borrowing. Fortunately, a recently passed law empowered the Post Office Department to contract for the transport of first-class mail by air. And down in New Hampshire, there was a pilot who had experience flying the mail, and he flew a Waco biplane with an air-cooled engine. He took the job. It wasn't easy, especially when, during his second week, the Post Office Department telegraphed asking him to put on a second plane and do 2 flights daily, plus 1 Sunday trip. Since he was a one-man, one-plane flying service, he did both trips, flying alone under severe winter conditions over the mountains, 600 miles a day, in sub-freezing temperatures, in a plane with an open cockpit. In this plane, he encountered as many as 5 sleet and snowstorms in a single day. His stock answer to, "Weren't you cold?" became, "Yes, the first half hour is tough, but by then I'm so numb I don't notice it." All through November and most of December, he flew to Montpelier or Barre and to Burlington, carrying 400 pounds of mail. He flew by compass, memory, a capacity for dead reckoning, and quick computation. Wearing a sheep-lined leather suit, helmet, goggles, mittens, and felt farmer's boots with sheepskin flying boots pulled over them, he flew the first trip and was back by noon to refuel man and plane before making the second trip. Sometimes fog or mechanical difficulties blocked his way, but 85% of his trips were complete. There were some forced landings and some close calls. The closest close call, Allen wrote, occurred on a return trip. A blanket of dense fog lay thick over all northern New England. Using his set the compass and estimate the time procedure, Fogg took his ship up to 8,000 feet before breaking out into sunshine and flew southeast to what should have been the vicinity of Concord. Then, pushing the stick gingerly forward, he started down, back into the fog, goggles misting as he peered over the edge of the cockpit. Down, down, and still soupy rain and zero visibility. 500, 400 read the altimeter, and lower, while Fogg, body cold but hands sweating, tried to catch a glimpse of Mother Earth. Abruptly, a hill loomed alongside his wingtip, and over on the other side a rocky crag. In the rain and murk, Fogg looked for a landmark. Directly below was a house. Almost unbelieving at his luck, he recognized it as Scragglewood, his own family summer place in Loudon, just 8 miles out of Concord. Gauging the valley that he knew by heart from boyhood, the shaken flyer wheeled the plane around. Cruising just over the treetops, he kept the dull gleam of the Sukuk River under his wing, down the valley to the safety of his home field. At the end, the Vermont House and Senate cited Fogg for his unprecedented service in the face of hazardous conditions. He was paid 50 cents a mile, but the publicity it brought him became the basis for even more lucrative flying assignments. During the 1920s, the idea of transatlantic flight was enormously exciting. Alcott and Brown had gone nonstop from Labrador to Ireland in 1919. Lindbergh made the first solo flight in 1927. But who was the first to fly the Atlantic nonstop in the opposite direction? Anyone who said Kapitan Hermann Kurl, Ehrenfried Günther Freiherr von Hünefeld, and Major James Fitzmaurice is correct. Their plane was the Bremen. Each crew member had made previous attempts to cross the Atlantic, but had to quit due to weather. Various attempts by other pilots had proved fatal. 16 people had died trying to cross the Atlantic in 1927. Due to a German government ban on cross-Atlantic tries, in April 1928, the crew of the Bremen flew their Junkers aircraft to Ireland. There they replaced their co-pilot with an Irishman, James Fitzmaurice. After a long stretch of weather delays, the Bremen left Baldonnel Aerodrome, Ireland, on April 12th, bound for Long Island. That same day, the news flashed across this country. On Tuesday, April 13th, people in the Northeast were alert for any sight or sound of the plane. All morning, nobody knew what was happening, but hordes gathered at Mitchell Field on Long Island, and hundreds went to the Boston airport to watch for a sign of the plane. Between 12:30 and 1 p.m., hundreds of Nashua residents called the newspaper office about seeing or hearing a plane overhead. But that was Bob Fogg, who had gone up to search the Maine coast for a sight of the Bremen. After flying about 50 miles beyond Portland, visibility being poor, he turned back. About an hour later, 2 p.m., the Bremen's crew, which was having its own problems with weather, sighted an island with a flat frozen bar off the coast of Labrador. They landed, breaking the ice and damaging the plane, but they made it. But just where were they? At a small, barren, rocky and remote island called Greenly Island. It was home to the lighthouse keeper's family. The closest telegraph office sent a message which was relayed by telegraph and wireless. A faint message was received in Newfoundland. German plane at Greenly Island, wind southeast, thick fog. A short time later, a second message was sent adding that the crew was well. In Manchester, New Hampshire, an 18-year-old boy with a homemade radio, Stu Davis, had been monitoring Canadian messages the whole time. When he picked up confirmation from the Canadian government radio in Nova Scotia, he contacted the Manchester Union, which got the news to the Associated Press. That night, the report was clicking in all the newsrooms of the country. April 14th, Canadian pilot Duke Schiller was the first to the scene to help the Bremen crew, who stayed with the plane for 2 weeks in hopes of repairing it. Every news service wanted their story, so newsmen and cameramen raced to get the first interviews, pictures, and newsreels. That had to be an air race, for the railroad left them at Murray Bay, 800 miles south of where the Bremen landed. 800 miles of vast, uninhabited space covered in snow. Greenly Island was hitherto only reached during the winter by dog sled, taking several weeks. Ice barred a landing by sea. The press requisitioned special trains, wireless dog sleds, telegraph and telephone, and airplanes. They came from Philadelphia, Hartford, New York, and Boston. According to a Globe reporter, this was a battle where generalship was matched with trickery, and where cameramen and newspapermen, almost desperate at the prospect of being scooped, were ready to fight. It wasn't just a race for first place, but also for money. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent by picture services and newspaper interests to get those pictures and market them. Having heard of Fogg's accomplishments during the Vermont flood, the newsreel concerns bid for his services. He chose the Pathé Company. His plan was to fly with their cameraman, Tommy Hogan, to Quebec, to Murray Bay, and then to Greenlee Island. It wouldn't be easy. It meant flying about 5,000 miles, flying day and night with no lights and sub-zero temperatures. It meant outfoxing all the rivals out to stop him, and the press covered his every move. On April 15th, unable to take off at first, he lightened his load by sending the plane's skis up by train from Concord to Quebec, where he exchanged them for the wheels. No baggage car being on the train, he said, we had to buy a berth for the skis. On April 16th, he took off no problem. He got to Quebec, landing at Lake St. Agnes, and attached the skis. Meanwhile, word came that Schiller was going to fly Fitzmaurice south to find replacement parts for the Bremen. The mass of pressmen were expecting him to land at Murray Bay. When Fogg arrived in Canada, everyone knew his reputation and that his plane was the fastest. Obstacles were put in his way. He was accused of custom violations, and threats were made to seize his plane and Tommy's camera because of certain custom requirements and the plane not having been Canadian surveyed. They were not to get any gasoline. Finally, he got permission to take to the air for a short flight to, quote, warm his oil. They did not come down until they hit 7 islands, more than 200 miles to the north. With some difficulty, they gassed up, and then in came, not to Murray Bay, but to 7 islands, Schiller's plane with Fitzmaurice aboard. As luck, Irish luck, would have it, Schiller recognized Hogan and took him to meet his countryman Fitzmaurice. Hogan got pictures, and both Hogan and Fogg spoke with Fitzmaurice, getting material for stories. They were not the only newsmen there, but Fogg managed to get away with Hogan's pictures by leading his rivals to think he was headed onward to Greenlee Island, when in fact, he went to Quebec to change skis for wheels and get to New York. Word got out of what he did at 7 Islands, so knowing his rivals would try to stop him, when he landed at Quebec for gas, a New York reporter wrote, he and his mechanic stayed with the plane all night, and when 3 toughs got past the guard, intent on sabotage, they brandished a .45 revolver to hold them off. The next morning, Fogg got Hogan's pictures to New York first, and Pathé distributed them across country immediately. Huge photo features appeared everywhere. Then Fogg turned around and made a second trip, this one going all the way to Greenlee Island. Thus, Pathé had moving pictures of the Bremen and its crew taken at the landing site, including an appearance by Arbol. When later addressing the Advertising Club of Boston, Fogg said, this Greenlee Island expedition was not exactly a tea party, but it was obvious that once I got started from Murray Bay for Greenlee, my ship would outfly any of our competitive planes that had been hired by the other newsreel groups. The scoop was what we were after, and the scoop was what we got. He also got paid $10,000. Incidental to this adventure, in Quebec, he crossed paths with Lindbergh, whom he had met when Lindy visited the Concord airport in 1927. As Lindbergh was not in the picture race, the two had a friendly moment for the press. Fogg was also the first to secure news and pictures in 1931, when the sealing ship Viking exploded near Horse Island off the coast of Newfoundland. The Viking had been chartered by the new Newfoundland Labrador Film Company for a feature film. On March 9th, there was an explosion, and the ship caught fire, leaving survivors to fend on the ice. They had all been taken away on rescue ships by the time Fogg arrived, but there was still that story to get. Hired by Paramount News and Associated Press, Fogg took off with a cameraman. While flying to Horse Island, he looked for additional survivors but saw none. On landing, the skis on his plane cracked up. Informed that the next steamship might arrive in June, he rebuilt the skis out of fragments and fence boards. "We worked nearly all night," he said. "I had to lie on my back on the ice under the plane and sew the wing, which he fixed using men's shirt backs." The locals helped chop a smooth runway, and off they went in the morning, again beating all rivals and marking up another news and picture scoop. Fogg himself wrote some of that news, having listened to stories from the locals about the survivors making their way across the ice, some in their underclothing, half frozen. Now, after the Wall Street crash, not so many people were taking pleasure seaplane trips. So Fogg developed the story of the Bremen into a lecture highly acclaimed, a tale not only of flying, but also intrigue. Among other places, his lecture brought him to Winchester in January 1930 and again in March 1931, when his hometown welcomed back the man the Star referred to as the foremost New England aviator. Now, there were more adventures. He flew First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt to sea-based dedications around the country, even letting her take the controls. But time forbids, and I cannot end the program without mentioning the very first person from Winchester licensed to fly an airship. That was J. Benton, by profession a newspaperman, a reporter, and CD editor for the Boston Transcript. Early in the 20th century, he became an aeronaut, one who flew balloons. But there was a difference between being a balloonist and an aeronaut. A single trip in a balloon, he wrote, could make a person a balloonist. And who wouldn't want that? "Every person who looks up in the air," he wrote, "feels his heart beat quicker and his nerves tingle with excitement. It must be glorious to float along like that forever, forever." But, he went on to explain in 2 long newspaper columns, there is a lot of drudgery and hard work, especially in packing up that balloon to get it home. "Those balloonists eager to go through all that and start over again," he wrote, "they are surely worthy to be called aeronauts con amore." Benton was an aeronaut. In 1909, he was the 33rd man in all America to receive a license as an international aeronautic pilot. He was a member of the Aero Club of New England, which was formed in 1907, had a balloon called the Boston, and elected Benton its president in 1912. Now, once there was an Aero Club, there was competition. One competition in particular created some excitement in Winchester. A trophy was offered by the Boston Herald for the balloon landing nearest Boston Common after starting no less than 40 miles away. A second trophy was offered by the Fitchburg Board of Trade for the pilot who started from Fitchburg and took the Herald Trophy. The closest landing to Boston had been in Lexington, when, on October 6, 1909, H. Clayton of Canton, a meteorologist, went up with 2 passengers, one being Benton. "Where would you like to land?" he asked them. "Winchester would satisfy me," Benton replied. "I'll do it," Clayton answered. And he did. As reported by the Winchester Star, the sight of a huge light brown balloon sailing majestically over the town stirred the residents of Winchester on Wednesday afternoon. And when, just after the center was passed, it was seen that the occupants of the balloon intended to make a landing in the open fields at the Highlands, excitement rose to fever heat. The flight took 2 hours and 5 minutes. In Winchester, the balloon was first seen shortly after 4 o'clock, coming slowly over the town from the southwest. The first landmark of the town to be discerned from the basket was the high school, which loomed up when they were many miles away. The landing was in a vacant field on Cross Street, near the new soccer fields. The big balloon coming down to a perfect stop and making a sight not soon to be forgotten by the crowd which flocked to see it. Benton praised Clayton's skills to the sky. It was purely a triumph of knowledge of atmospheric conditions. His complete knowledge of air currents enabled him to maintain his course without deviation. Clayton had beaten the previous record by 4 miles. Since no one then bested him, he won both trophies. By the end of the month, Benton had his own license. He had more adventures, such as the solo flight when he passed through 2 snowstorms 3,000 feet in the air, and his first solo flight from Lowell to Newbury. A life-saving crew on Plum Island caught sight of his balloon nearing the ocean and hurried into their boat, expecting to have to rescue him from the sea. However, a rapid descent landed him about a mile from the shore. In 1912, with a companion pilot, he won his own award after flying the balloon from Pittsfield, Massachusetts to Pittston, Maine, a distance of 220 miles, establishing a new record for the longest balloon flight in New England. It was truly an age of wonders, which continued from aeronauts to aviators to astronauts. To conclude, sometimes people say the world needs more heroes, and sometimes they're there. Their stories just need to be uncovered. Stories not just of adventure, but of ingenuity, self-sacrifice, bravery, endurance, perseverance, spirit. And you don't have to look further than your own town. And with that, I'll conclude and open it up for any audience comments or questions.
Thank you so much, Ellen. That was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
And I will love to open the floor. I'm going to knock on wood that I stay connected and have no more technical difficulties. But please, whether you want to use the chat to ask a question or you want to come off mute and ask a question, the floor is ours. So Ellen, one question I had is let's start. What was your inspiration for doing this research? What got you curious and wanting to dig in?
I probably started with my researches into World War II during the 75th anniversary of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
That's when I learned about Gertrude and, of course, about all the World War II flyers. And I don't know. My research interests jump around here and there. So I might be interested, had some inspiration at one point, and then could have been a few years later, a similar topic cropped up in my research.
Well, I have to tell you, these stories were amazing. And you're right, the bravery, the perseverance, the grit. These were heroes.
They were.
And I'm also curious in terms of like families who might still be local. Do you have any sense on if any of these folks still have connections in the town today?
Well, Jimmy Keenan does. His nephew, some people might actually recognize that name because
Yep.
His nephew, Jimmy Keenan, has been a surveyor in Winchester for forever. And in fact, I contacted him when I was working on World War II just to ask him if he had any good pictures of his uncle in uniform. He said, no. But no, a lot of these people scattered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The only one I know who is permanently with us in Wildwood is Jimmy Keenan.
Excellent. Thank you. Any other questions? Well, Ellen, I wanted to thank you so much for this wonderful story and presentation. And I wanted to thank also everyone for joining us. I'm going to share my screen just to give you a preview of some programs coming ahead. On April 1st, we actually have something a little bit different. It's a fundraiser, but it promises to be a real fun one. So April 1st, April Fool's Day, we're hosting a beach party at the Sanborn House. So we're going to have live music with a 60s surfer vibe, and I welcome all to come and help us raise some funds so that we can repair our chimneys. And then in April on the 19th at the Sanborn House, we're having a program on the Fells Forest Festival. Say that 10 times fast. But we're happy to be back in person, and we hope to see you then too. So without further ado, let me just check. Lots of thanks, Ellen, in the chat for your program. Very much enjoyed the stories. And thank you so much for what you shared this evening.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we hope to see you soon.